He was universally acclaimed and immortalized in legend as the perfect Christian knight, the epitome of chivalry and manly virtue. Yet beneath his shining armor and adoring ballads, he shared a bed not with a queen, but with another king, left no heir to the throne, and carried a secret so deep it could shatter the foundations of his kingdom. He was Richard the Lionheart. How could the truth of this man be so perfectly buried by the legend of the lion? Our story begins not in England, but in Oxford, on the 8th of September, 1157. Richard was born into a world on fire. He was the third son of one of history's most formidable power couples, King Henry II of England and the brilliant, indomitable Eleanor of Aquitaine. To call his family dysfunctional would be a gross understatement. They were a dynasty at war with itself. His father, Henry II, was a man of boundless energy and ferocious temper. He built the Angevin Empire, a sprawling realm that made him arguably Europe's most powerful monarch. Henry was a micromanager, a restless force of nature who was constantly on the move, asserting his authority, putting down rebellions, and battling with the church. He demanded absolute loyalty, which bred deep resentment, especially in his sons. And then there was his mother, Eleanor. She was a legend in her own right. She was Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, ruling a vast, wealthy, and culturally sophisticated domain in southern France. Aquitaine was the land of the troubadours, of courtly love, of poetry and song, a world far removed from the damp, pragmatic climate of England. Eleanor was fiercely intelligent, politically astute, and passionately protective of her own rights and the inheritance of her sons. Her marriage to Henry began in passion but soon curdled into a bitter political rivalry. They were two titans locked in a struggle for power, and their children were their pawns, their allies, and ultimately their weapons against each other. Richard grew up in this cauldron of ambition and betrayal. He was not expected to be king. His elder brother, Henry the Young King, was the designated heir. This fact shaped Richard profoundly. While the young king was groomed for the throne of England, Richard was sent to be invested as the Duke of Aquitaine. He became his mother's son, steeped in the vibrant, rebellious culture of the South. It was here, in the sun-drenched lands of Aquitaine, that Richard learned to rule, to fight, and to love. He learned the art of war not in grand set-piece battles, but in the brutal, relentless castle sieges against his own rebellious vassals. He became a master strategist and a fearless frontline commander. But he also became a patron of the arts, a lover of music, and even a poet himself. He was a paradox from the very beginning, a cultured warrior, a brutal aesthete. His relationship with his mother was the defining bond of his youth. Eleanor saw in Richard her own fiery spirit and nurtured his independence. The family dynamic was explosive. This tension finally erupted in 1173 in what became known as the Great Revolt. It was an astonishing act of patricidal rebellion. Egged on by their mother and secretly supported by the King of France, Richard and his brothers rose up in open war against their own father. Richard was only 15 years old. The revolt was a brutal, sprawling conflict that tore the Angevin Empire apart. For nearly 2 years, son fought against father, and brother against brother. Ultimately, Henry II, the old lion, proved too strong. Henry crushed the rebellion swiftly. He was merciful to his sons, accepting their submission, but for his wife, there was no forgiveness. Henry had Eleanor imprisoned. She would remain under lock and key for the next 16 years, a political prisoner of her own husband. Her imprisonment was a deep wound for Richard, a festering source of resentment against his father that would never truly heal. It cemented his identity as his mother's champion and his father's adversary. The years that followed were a cold war within the family. Richard returned to Aquitaine to brutally suppress the vassals who had betrayed him, earning a reputation for both military genius and ruthless cruelty. He was no longer a boy playing at war, he was a hardened commander. The family peace was fragile, constantly shattered by new rounds of plotting and conflict. The brothers, once allied against their father, now turned on each other, vying for power and territory. It was during this turbulent period in the late 1170s and 1180s that another crucial figure entered Richard's life. A young man who was his rival, his peer, and his kingdom's greatest threat, Philip, the heir to the throne of France. Philip Augustus, later Philip II, was Richard's opposite in many ways. Where Richard was tall, athletic, and charismatic, the classic warrior prince, Philip was more physically frail, calculating, and patient. He was a master of diplomacy and intrigue, a spider weaving a web that would one day ensnare the Angevin lions. The French kings had long been overshadowed by their powerful English vassals. Philip's life's work was to change that, to break the Angevin Empire and make the King of France the true master of his own kingdom. And his greatest tool in this endeavor was the infighting of the Plantagenet family. Philip became an expert at playing the sons against the father. He would befriend one brother, promise him support, and encourage his rebellion, only to switch his allegiance when it suited him. It was a dangerous game, but Philip played it brilliantly. He found a particularly receptive partner in Richard. By the mid-1180s, Richard's relationship with his father, Henry II, had completely broken down. Richard was convinced Henry intended to disinherit him in favor of his youngest and favorite son, John. Feeling betrayed and cornered, Richard did something that was both politically astute and deeply personal. He turned to Philip. The two young men formed an intense and immediate bond. They were of a similar age, both facing the immense pressures of their future crowns. They were united by a common enemy, Henry II. They hunted together, plotted together, and swore oaths of allegiance to one another. But according to the chroniclers of the day, their closeness went far beyond a typical political alliance. This is where the official story begins to crack, and the whispers of a hidden truth emerge. The chronicler Roger of Howden, a contemporary and generally reliable source, wrote something truly astonishing about their relationship. He described how Philip so honored him, Richard, for so long that they ate every day at the same table and from the same dish, and at night their beds did not separate them. Let's pause and consider that for a moment. Their beds did not separate them. Howden goes on to say, "And the King of France loved him as his own soul. And they loved each other so much that the King of England, Henry II, was seized with great astonishment at the passionate love between them and wondered what it could mean." Henry II was right to be astonished. While bed-sharing between men of high status was not entirely unheard of, as a political gesture of trust and alliance in the medieval period, the language Howden uses, passionate love, loved him as his own soul, is electric. It suggests an emotional intensity that transcends mere politics. They were not just allies, they were inseparable. They presented a united front to the world, a defiant image of brotherhood and loyalty that stood in stark contrast to the bitter divisions in Richard's own family. For Richard, who had grown up in a world of paternal betrayal, Philip's devoted friendship must have felt like a sanctuary. For Philip, this intense bond was a priceless political weapon. But was it more than that? The bond between them became the catalyst for the final tragic chapter of Henry II's reign. In 1187, news reached Europe that was so catastrophic it temporarily united all of Christendom. Jerusalem had fallen to the armies of Saladin. A new crusade was called, and all the kings of Europe, including Henry, Richard, and Philip, took the cross, vowing to journey to the Holy Land to reclaim the city. But even the call of God could not heal the rift in the Plantagenet family. Richard deeply suspected his father of using the crusade as an excuse to sideline him. The final straw came over Richard's betrothal. For years, Richard had been formally engaged to Philip's half-sister Alice, but Henry II had kept the princess at his court and repeatedly delayed the wedding. Rumors swirled, ugly, persistent rumors, that the old king had actually taken Alice as his own mistress. For Richard, this was an unforgivable stain upon his honor. In 1189, backed by Philip, Richard launched his final war against his father. This was no youthful rebellion. This was a calculated, ruthless campaign to seize the crown. The campaign was a stunning success. Richard and Philip, fighting side by side, hounded the aging and ailing Henry II across France. They cornered him, defeated his forces, and forced him into a humiliating peace treaty. The final meeting between father and son was heartbreaking. Henry, broken and feverish, was forced to give Richard the kiss of peace, a formal gesture of reconciliation he clearly did not feel. As Richard turned to leave, Henry is said to have muttered, "May God not let me die until I have taken a worthy revenge on you." They were his last words to his son. 2 days later, upon learning that his favorite son, John, had also betrayed him and joined the rebellion, Henry II's great heart finally gave out. Cursing his children in the day he was born, the first Plantagenet king of England died, abandoned and alone. Richard, now king of England, reportedly went to view his father's body. As he stood there, blood began to flow from the dead king's nose, a medieval sign that the murderer was present. Whether out of guilt, sorrow, or a sense of grim triumph, Richard was said to have wept. The long, bitter war was over. He was Richard I, King of England, Duke of Normandy, and Count of Anjou. His first act as king, to journey to the prison where his mother Eleanor had languished for 16 years and set her free. His second act was to begin preparations for the venture that would define his legend, the Third Crusade. He was at the height of his power, allied with his dearest friend, Philip, and about to embark on a holy quest. The world lay at his feet. But the very forces that had brought him to the throne, his passionate nature, his complex loyalties, and his intense bond with the King of France, would soon conspire to create a storm of controversy, betrayal, and heartbreak in the sun-scorched lands of the East. The stage was set for a drama that would test not only his crown, but the very nature of his heart. With his father in the ground and his mother freed from her long imprisonment, Richard the Lionheart stood on the precipice of his destiny. On the 3rd of September, 1189, he was crowned King of England in a ceremony of breathtaking splendor at Westminster Abbey. For the people of England, who had only known him as a rebellious French duke, this was their first glimpse of the man who would now rule them. He was charismatic, regal, and radiated an aura of raw, untamed power. But Richard had no deep affection for England. To him it was not a home, it was a treasure chest, a source of funds for the one great obsession that now consumed him, the crusade. He had taken the cross, sworn an oath to God to reclaim Jerusalem, and nothing and no one would stand in his way. He set about raising money with a ruthless, single-minded efficiency that shocked even his most seasoned administrators. He sold off sheriffdoms, castles, lordships, and high offices of state to the highest bidder. When one of his advisors cautioned him, Richard is said to have retorted, "I would have sold London itself if I could have found a buyer." This frenzied fundraising had a dark and bloody underbelly. The coronation festivities were marred by a horrific outbreak of anti-Semitic violence. Pogroms erupted in London and then spread to other cities like York. Jewish communities, who were seen as being under the king's direct protection and were often involved in money lending, became scapegoats for a populace whipped into a religious frenzy. While Richard did not order these massacres and in some cases even punish the perpetrators, his crusade rhetoric undoubtedly fanned the flames of intolerance. It was a brutal reminder that the age of chivalry was also an age of profound prejudice and violence. The Lionheart's quest for glory was being financed, in part, by the persecution of the innocent. It was a stain on the beginning of his reign, a detail often glossed over in the heroic ballads. By the summer of 1190, Richard had amassed a colossal fortune, a formidable army, and a huge fleet of ships. His preparations were complete. He had entrusted the governance of his kingdom to capable, if not entirely loyal hands, and was ready to depart, and he would not be traveling alone. Waiting for him in France was his sworn brother-in-arms, his passionate friend, King Philip II. The two most powerful kings in Christendom were about to embark on a holy war together. Their friendship, forged in rebellion against Richard's father, now seemed to be the bedrock of the entire crusading enterprise. They met at Vézelay, a symbolic starting point for previous crusades, and swore a fresh oath. They pledged to defend one another's lands while they were away, and to share equally in all the spoils of their conquests. To the assembled knights and nobles, it must have seemed like the dawn of a new era of Christian unity, led by two kings, bound by a love as strong as any marriage. The two armies marched south through France together, a magnificent, glittering river of steel and faith. They were a sight to behold. But as they traveled, the first subtle cracks in the foundation of their friendship began to appear. Richard was the star of the show. He was the charismatic warrior, the embodiment of the crusading ideal. He was generous with his money, lavishing gifts on his followers, and naturally drew the adoration of the troubadours and knights who flocked to his banner. Philip, by contrast, was more reserved, more calculating, and less physically impressive. He began to look less like Richard's equal and more like his sullen, resentful shadow. The seeds of jealousy were being sown. They journeyed to Marseille, where Richard's fleet was waiting. Philip, whose own lands were largely landlocked, had to hire ships to transport his smaller force. They agreed to rendezvous on the island of Sicily for the winter, before making the final crossing to the Holy Land the following spring. It was a practical decision, but it would prove to be a disastrous one for their relationship. Sicily, the balmy crossroads of the Mediterranean, would become the cold, bitter crucible where their passionate love was tested, fractured, and ultimately broken. When Richard and Philip arrived in Messina in September 1190, they entered a political hornet's nest. The Norman kingdom of Sicily had recently been thrown into chaos. The old king, William II, had died, and the throne had been seized by his illegitimate cousin, Tancred. There was just one problem. King William's rightful heir was his aunt, Constance, who was married to the Holy Roman Emperor, a major rival to both Richard and Philip. Furthermore, King William had been married to Richard's own sister, Joan. Following the coup, Tancred had imprisoned the Dowager Queen Joan and seized her vast inheritance. Richard, the ever-protective brother and a man with an unbending sense of his own rights, was not about to let this stand. He arrived in Messina not as a humble pilgrim, but as an avenging king. He set up his camp outside the city walls and immediately demanded that Tancred release his sister and return her dowry in full. Philip, meanwhile, was welcomed into the city by Tancred and took up residence in the royal palace. From the very beginning, they were on opposite sides of a tense local conflict. Richard was outside the gates making aggressive demands. Philip was inside, playing the role of the reasonable diplomat. The local populace, a mixture of Greeks and Sicilians, quickly grew to resent the arrogant, boisterous English and Norman troops camped in their midst. Tensions escalated. Fights broke out in the taverns and markets. Soon the entire city was a powder keg. On October 4th, it exploded. Following a brawl, the citizens of Messina rose up, closed the city gates, and attacked Richard's men. This was an insult Richard could not bear. In a furious rage, he unleashed the full force of his army. He stormed the city, his Lionheart banner flying at the head of the charge. His men swept through Messina, looting and pillaging. Richard himself rode to the palace where Philip was staying and had his banners planted on the walls, a clear and provocative statement of dominance. For Philip, this was a profound humiliation. Here was Richard, his supposed friend and equal, acting like a conquering warlord in a neutral city, a city where Philip himself was an honored guest. He saw it as a flagrant breach of their sworn oath. He demanded that Richard remove his banners. Richard, in a token gesture, agreed to have them taken down and placed in the custody of the Knights Templar and Hospitaller, but the damage was done. The trust between them was corroded. The passionate love that Roger of Howden had described was curdling into suspicion and rivalry. Over the long winter months, things only got worse. They were two kings, two alpha males with massive armies, cooped up in a small space. Their men brawled, and their nobles schemed. Richard, having forced Tancred to submit, now acted as the de facto ruler of the island. He spent lavishly, held magnificent tournaments, and charmed everyone, while Philip's resources and patience dwindled. Philip felt upstaged, disrespected, and increasingly eager to get away from his overbearing friend. Then came the final fatal blow to their friendship, and it arrived in the form of two women. In March 1191, a fleet arrived in Messina. On board were two of the most important figures in Richard's life: his formidable mother, the 70-year-old Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had journeyed all the way from England, and with her was a young woman Richard had barely ever met, Princess Berengaria of Navarre. Eleanor, the master political strategist, had decided that it was high time for her 33-year-old childless son to marry. The future of the dynasty depended on it. She had personally traveled to the small kingdom of Navarre in the Pyrenees and negotiated a marriage pact for Richard with Berengaria. She was now delivering the bride to her son. For Philip, this was the ultimate betrayal. Why? Because Richard had, for over 20 years, been officially betrothed to Philip's own half-sister Alice. All this time, Richard had refused to marry her, using the excuse of her supposed affair with his father, Henry II. But now he was publicly casting Alice aside for another woman. It was a devastating public insult to Philip's family and his royal honor. It made a mockery of their supposed friendship. When Philip confronted Richard, the English king was blunt. He declared he could never marry Alice because she had borne a child to his father. Whether this was true or just a convenient and cruel excuse, we'll never know. But it was the point of no return. Philip, seething with anger and humiliation, demanded to be released from his crusading oath. He wanted to go home. Richard, knowing he couldn't afford to have the French king abandon the crusade, refused. They patched together a tense, fragile agreement. Philip would stay, but their friendship was dead. The intimate bond, the shared beds, the declarations of love, all of it was shattered, replaced by a cold, bitter political necessity. And what of Berengaria in all this? She is one of history's most tragic and overlooked queens. Thrown into the heart of this royal maelstrom, she was a political pawn in a game she had no say in. She was brought to a foreign land to marry a man she did not know, a famous warrior king whose heart, it seemed, was already engaged elsewhere, first with another king, and now solely with the prospect of war. Her arrival had served its purpose. It had secured a political alliance for Richard's lands bordering Navarre, and it had irrevocably broken his bond with Philip. As soon as Eleanor had delivered the bride, she departed for home, leaving Berengaria in the care of Richard's sister, Joan. Richard, however, did not marry her immediately. Lent was approaching, a season during which marriage was forbidden. So his fiancée and his sister were bundled onto a separate ship, and the crusading fleet finally set sail from Sicily in April 1191, heading for the Holy Land. The winter of discontent was over, but the voyage ahead would be fraught with even greater peril, leading to an unexpected conquest and a wedding in the midst of war. Richard had rid himself of one complicated relationship, only to be saddled with another he showed little enthusiasm for. The Lionheart was sailing towards his destiny at Acre, but he was more alone than ever before. The journey across the Mediterranean was not a smooth one. A violent storm scattered the massive fleet. While Richard's ship found safe harbor in Rhodes, the vessel carrying his sister Joan and his fiancée Berengaria was driven off course. It was shipwrecked on the coast of Cyprus. Cyprus was then ruled by a renegade Byzantine prince named Isaac Komnenos, a self-styled emperor and a notorious tyrant. Seeing the rich prize that had washed up on his shore, Isaac seized the shipwrecked survivors and their treasure. He refused to let Joan and Berengaria leave, holding them as well-treated but valuable hostages. When Richard learned of this, his famous temper ignited. This was not just a political inconvenience, it was a profound personal insult. A petty tyrant had dared to lay hands on his family and his future queen. He sailed for Cyprus immediately. He landed at Limassol and demanded that Isaac release his prisoners and return all the stolen property. Isaac, arrogant and foolish, sent back a defiant refusal. He had severely underestimated his opponent. For Richard, this was a welcome diversion, a chance to unleash his military might, to win glory, and to fill his coffers. In a lightning campaign that lasted less than a month, Richard the Lionheart did what no one had thought possible. He conquered the entire island of Cyprus. He smashed Isaac's forces, captured the tyrant himself, reportedly imprisoning him in chains of silver because he had promised not to put him in irons, and made himself the master of a wealthy and strategically vital new kingdom. It was a stunning military achievement, a testament to his tactical genius and audacious spirit. And it was in the midst of this whirlwind of conquest that Richard finally decided to get married. On the 12th of May, 1191, in the chapel of St. George in Limassol, Richard the Lionheart married Berengaria of Navarre. The bride was crowned Queen of England on the very same day. It was one of the strangest royal weddings in history. It took place on a newly conquered island, thousands of miles from England, during a brief lull in a military campaign on the way to a holy war. There was no great romance to it. It was an act of political and dynastic duty fulfilled almost as an afterthought. Contemporary accounts describe the ceremony as magnificent, but they tell us almost nothing about the couple themselves. Immediately after the wedding, Richard threw himself back into preparing for the final leg of his journey. His mind was not on his new bride. It was on the war that awaited him. It's said that their marriage was consummated on Cyprus, but if so, it was one of the few nights they would ever spend together. The new Queen of England would spend the vast majority of her married life living apart from her husband. She was a queen without a kingdom and a wife without a husband. With Cyprus secured and his duty to his dynasty technically fulfilled, Richard finally set sail for the Holy Land. He arrived at the city of Acre in early June 1191. The great siege of Acre had been raging for nearly 2 years. The Christian forces, a coalition of local knights and the vanguard of the crusade, were themselves besieged by the vast armies of Saladin. It was a brutal, bloody stalemate. Richard's arrival with his fresh troops, his fearsome reputation, and the wealth of Cyprus was like a shot of divine adrenaline. He was greeted as a savior, but someone else was already there, waiting for him in the Crusader camp. Someone who had watched Richard's conquest of Cyprus with a mixture of awe and bitter envy, King Philip of France. Their reunion was not that of long-lost friends. It was the tense, wary meeting of two bitter rivals, forced to cooperate in the face of a common enemy. The stage was now set for the ultimate clash of wills, not only against Saladin, but between the two kings who had once shared a bed and sworn to love each other as their own souls. When Richard the Lionheart's fleet dropped anchor off the coast of Acre in June of 1191, he did not find a glorious Christian army on the verge of victory. He found a charnel house. For 2 long years, the Crusaders had been locked in a hellish stalemate. They were besieging the Muslim garrison within the city of Acre, while they themselves were being besieged from without by the mighty field army of the Sultan Saladin. The Christian camp was a sprawling, disease-ridden city of tents, plagued by hunger, filth, and despair. Morale was at rock bottom, into this grim theater of war. His reputation had preceded him, and his arrival with a fresh fleet, seasoned troops, and the plundered wealth of Cyprus sent a wave of euphoria through the weary Christian ranks. He was their savior, their champion, the Lionheart come to deliver them. He immediately began to put his vast resources to work, paying his own soldiers, and even those of other lords, a generous wage of 3 gold pieces a day month, a move that won him immense popularity and instantly highlighted the relative poverty of his royal rival. King Philip of France was already there, of course. He had arrived a few weeks earlier and had begun his own siege operations, but his presence had failed to break the deadlock. Now he had to watch as Richard, his former friend, completely eclipsed him. The air in the Crusader camp was thick not only with dust and disease, but with the suffocating tension between the two kings. They established separate headquarters. Their men brawled in the camp's squalid taverns, and their nobles chose sides. The grand alliance of Christendom was, in reality, 2 rival factions, locked in a barely concealed power struggle. For Philip, it was a daily dose of poison. Richard was the bigger personality, the better warrior, the richer king. The troubadours and knights who thrive on charisma and largesse flocked to the English king's banner. Richard had also brought with him colossal siege engines, terrifying stone-throwing trebuchets with names like Bad Neighbor and God's Own Stone Thrower. He was a whirlwind of martial energy, and Philip, who was by nature more cautious and less of a frontline soldier, was left in his wake. Then, shortly after his arrival, Richard was struck down by a mysterious and agonizing illness. The chronicles call it Arnaldia, a sickness characterized by high fevers, shaking fits, and hair and fingernails falling out. It was likely a severe form of scurvy, trench fever, or some other camp disease. The great warrior was confined to his bed, unable to even mount his horse. But even from his sick bed, Richard directed the war. He was carried out on a silken litter to oversee the positioning of his siege engines and offered bounties to any soldier who would pull down a stone from Acre's walls. He was a lion, even when caged by fever. Philip, too, fell ill, but it was Richard's dramatic sickness and his refusal to be bowed by it that captured the imagination of the army. Despite the rivalry, the combined pressure of the two armies and their powerful siege weapons was too much for the beleaguered garrison of Acre. On the 12th of July, 1191, after a final brutal assault, the city surrendered. It was a momentous victory, the first major success of the Third Crusade. The Christian banners were raised over the battered walls of Acre. For a fleeting moment there was unity and triumph, but that moment was shattered almost immediately. In the chaotic aftermath of the victory, a dispute erupted that would have far-reaching and fatal consequences for Richard. According to the chronicles, the banner of Duke Leopold V of Austria was raised over a section of the walls alongside those of the kings of England and France. Richard's men, either on his orders or sensing his wishes, saw this as an outrageous presumption. A mere duke claiming equal status with a king? They tore Leopold's banner down and threw it into the city's moat. It was a stunningly arrogant and politically idiotic act. Duke Leopold, the leader of the German contingent of the crusade, was profoundly and publicly humiliated. He would never forgive Richard. This single act of hubris, born from Richard's unbending sense of hierarchy, created an enemy who would one day have his revenge in the most devastating way imaginable. The fall of Acre did not heal the rift between Richard and Philip, it ripped it wide open. They quarreled bitterly over the division of the city, the spoils of war, and the captured Muslim garrison. They also backed rival claimants to the throne of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Richard supported the affable but militarily inept Guy de Lusignan, while Philip championed the more capable and ruthless Conrad of Montferrat. Every issue became a proxy battle for their own supremacy. Finally, Philip could take no more. At the end of July, just a few weeks after their great victory, he announced his intention to return to France. He claimed he was still gravely ill and that he had fulfilled his crusading vow. The army was stunned. To Richard and his supporters, this was nothing short of desertion. It was an act of cowardice and betrayal. They were in the heart of enemy territory, with Saladin's army just miles away, and the King of France was abandoning them. The reality was more complex. Philip was certainly ill, and he was undoubtedly exhausted by living in Richard's shadow. But he was also a shrewd political operator. He saw an opportunity. With Richard bogged down in the Holy Land, Philip's own kingdom would be secure, and Richard's vast wealthy lands in France would be vulnerable. Their farewell was icy. Richard, seething with contempt, forced Philip to swear a solemn oath that he would not attack English lands while Richard was away on crusade. Philip swore the oath, but as he sailed away from the coast of Palestine, leaving the bulk of his army behind under Richard's command, both men knew that the oath was meaningless. The passionate friendship forged in rebellion was now a smoldering ruin of hatred. The King of France was going home to plot, and Richard the Lionheart was now the sole undisputed commander of the Third Crusade. He was finally in his element, alone in command, and facing the greatest warrior in the Muslim world. Richard's first major challenge as sole commander was the fate of the thousands of Muslim soldiers, along with their wives and children, who had surrendered at Acre. The terms of the surrender were clear. The garrison would be spared in exchange for a large ransom of gold, the return of 1,500 Christian prisoners, and the restoration of the relic of the True Cross, which Saladin had captured at the Battle of Hattin 4 years earlier. But the negotiations dragged on. Saladin, a master of delay, prevaricated. He and Richard exchanged courteous messages and even gifts, a sign of the mutual respect between the two commanders. But the prisoners and the ransom did not materialize on the agreed-upon date. Richard grew impatient. His army was eager to march on Jerusalem, and the massive captive population was a logistical nightmare. They consumed food and water and required a huge contingent of guards, preventing the army from moving. Richard felt that Saladin was playing for time, hoping to bog the Crusaders down at Acre. He decided he needed to make a statement, a brutal, terrifying statement that would demonstrate his resolve and break the deadlock. On the 20th of August, 1191, Richard made a decision that would forever tarnish his chivalric reputation. He ordered all the Muslim prisoners from the Acre garrison, nearly 3,000 men, and according to some sources, their wives and children as well, to be marched out of the city to a small hill called Ayadi, in full view of the outposts of Saladin's army. There, as the Sultan's soldiers watched in horror, Richard's men systematically executed every single one of them. It was an act of shocking brutality, a war crime by any modern standard. Even by medieval standards, it was considered exceptionally cruel. To its defenders, it was a harsh but necessary military decision. It freed up Richard's army to march south, and it was intended as a ruthless act of psychological warfare, a message to Saladin that Richard the Lionheart was not a man to be trifled with. But it was also an act that revealed the core of cold, pragmatic cruelty that lay beneath Richard's charismatic exterior. The hero of the troubadours was also capable of being a butcher. Saladin, for his part, would later retaliate by executing the Christian prisoners he held. The Holy War had descended into a spiral of vengeance. With the grim business at Acre concluded, Richard turned his army south. His objective was the port city of Jaffa, the next stepping stone on the road to Jerusalem. The march from Acre to Jaffa was one of the most remarkable tactical achievements of the entire medieval period. Richard knew that Saladin's army, with its lightning-fast Turkish horse archers, would shadow him every step of the way, harassing his flanks, picking off stragglers, and waiting for a single moment of weakness to descend for the kill. He organized his army into a tight, disciplined marching column. It was like a moving fortress. On the side facing the land, he placed his infantry, armed with spears and crossbows, to form a protective wall. Inside this wall marched the precious heavy cavalry, the knights on their war horses, shielded from the constant arrow fire. On the other flank, the army was protected by the sea, where Richard's fleet sailed in parallel, providing a constant source of supplies and a refuge for the sick and wounded. For almost 3 weeks, this Christian fortress crawled down the sun-scorched Palestinian coast under relentless attack. The heat was suffocating, the thirst was agonizing, and the air was thick with the dust of the Turkish horses and the constant hiss of arrows. Saladin threw everything he had at them, trying to provoke them, to lure the knights into a premature, disorganized charge where they could be surrounded and annihilated. But Richard's discipline was iron. He rode up and down the lines, keeping his men in formation, forbidding any retaliation. The knights had to endure the taunts and the arrows, a supreme test of their chivalric patience. Finally, on the 7th of September, 1191, near a place called Arsuf, Saladin decided the time had come for a decisive blow. He launched his entire army in an all-out assault. The Turkish horse archers, the Bedouin light cavalry, the Sudanese infantry, they slammed into the Christian column in wave after wave. The rear guard, made up of the Knights Hospitaller, took the brunt of the attack. They were being cut to pieces. Their discipline, stretched to the breaking point for weeks, finally snapped. Against Richard's explicit orders, the Grand Master of the Hospitallers and another knight broke ranks and launched a desperate charge against the enemy. It was the moment of weakness Saladin had been waiting for, but it was also the moment Richard had been anticipating. Seeing the charge begin, he knew he had two choices: let the Hospitallers be destroyed, or commit his entire force and turn their blunder into a thunderclap of victory. He did not hesitate. Signaling a full-scale charge with a blast of trumpets, Richard the Lionheart personally led his knights in a devastating counterattack. It was the moment they had all been waiting for. After weeks of disciplined patience, the pent-up fury of the Crusader heavy cavalry was finally unleashed. The impact was cataclysmic. They smashed into Saladin's ranks like a tidal wave of steel, shattering his formations and carving a bloody path through his army. Richard was in the thick of it, his great battle axe rising and falling, a terrifying whirlwind of destruction. The chroniclers say he was everywhere, that no one could stand before him. The Battle of Arsuf was a stunning, decisive victory for the crusade. Richard had met the legendary Saladin in open battle and had utterly defeated him. He had proven that Saladin's army was not invincible. The myth of the Lionheart was now forged in the blood and dust of a real battlefield. The victory secured the coast, opened the road to Jaffa, and sent a shock wave of renewed hope through the Christian world. Jerusalem, the ultimate prize, now seemed within his grasp. But war is never so simple. The Lionheart had won the battle, but the struggle for the holy city and the battle against the enemies gathering in his own homeland was far from over. The victory at Arsuf was glorious, but it was also costly. Saladin's army, though defeated, was not destroyed. It had melted away into the interior, ready to regroup and harass the Crusaders once more. Richard led his exhausted but triumphant army into the port city of Jaffa, which Saladin's forces had hastily abandoned and dismantled. The Crusaders now had a secure base, a vital link to their fleet, and a clear road ahead of them. The holy city of Jerusalem, the ultimate goal of their entire monumental undertaking, lay just 50 miles inland. It was so close they could almost feel its sacred presence on the wind. The army was buzzing with anticipation. They believed the final triumphant march was about to begin, but Richard the Lionheart, the impetuous warrior, was also a shrewd and pragmatic commander. He knew the road to Jerusalem was a trap. Marching inland would mean leaving the safety of his fleet and his supply lines. It would mean exposing his army to the full might of Saladin's forces in the barren, waterless hills of Judea. Even if they reached the city, a long siege would be impossible without a reliable source of food, water, and reinforcements. Saladin could simply cut them off and starve them into submission. Richard knew that taking Jerusalem was one thing, holding it was another entirely. So he made a decision that was militarily sound but devastating to morale. He announced that the army would stay in Jaffa to rebuild its fortifications and secure the coastline before any advance on Jerusalem. For the common soldiers and pilgrims who had endured so much in the belief that they were on the verge of liberating Christ's city, this was a bitter disappointment. The euphoria of Arsuf began to fade, replaced by the tedious, back-breaking work of hauling stone and digging ditches under the relentless Palestinian sun. As the weeks turned into months, the Crusader army, that magnificent but unwieldy instrument of war, began to rot from within. The old rivalries and factions, temporarily forgotten in the heat of battle, resurfaced with a vengeance. The most poisonous division was the ongoing dispute over who should be the king of Jerusalem. Richard continued to back his vassal from Poitou, the placid and ineffectual Guy de Lusignan. The French contingent, along with many of the local barons, championed the cause of the far more capable and ruthless Conrad of Montferrat, the heroic defender of Tyre. The conflict paralyzed the army. Conrad, secure in his fortress city of Tyre, refused to join Richard's main force unless his claim to the throne was recognized. The French contingent, loyal to their absent King Philip and hostile to Richard, became a sullen and uncooperative bloc within the camp. They complained, they schemed, and they openly questioned Richard's leadership. The great crusading army was devolving into a bickering, disunited mob. Richard tried to break the deadlock through diplomacy. He and Saladin, the two great adversaries, reopened negotiations. They communicated through envoys, exchanging proposals for peace. At one point, Richard made an astonishingly bizarre and unconventional offer. He proposed that his own sister, Joan, the widowed Queen of Sicily, should marry Saladin's brother, Al-Adil. Together, they would rule Jerusalem as a joint Christian-Muslim kingdom. It was a wildly imaginative, almost modern, piece of diplomatic thinking, an attempt to cut the Gordian knot of religious hatred. Al-Adil was apparently intrigued by the idea, but for the religious hardliners on both sides, it was pure heresy. The priests in the Christian camp were scandalized at the thought of a Christian queen marrying a Muslim infidel. The proposal, unsurprisingly, went nowhere. It was a sign of Richard's desperate, creative, and perhaps naive search for a solution that didn't involve a bloody, uncertain siege. Finally, by the autumn of 1191, with his army growing restless, Richard knew he had to act. He led the army out of Jaffa and began a slow, cautious advance inland. They captured the fortress of Ramla and pushed on towards Beit Nuba, a mere 12 miles from Jerusalem. It was now deep into winter. The weather turned against them. The heavens opened and torrential rains began to fall. The mild Mediterranean climate gave way to a cold, miserable deluge. The Crusaders' chainmail rusted, their food supplies rotted, and their tents were washed away in rivers of mud. The road to Jerusalem became an impassable quagmire. In January 1192, Richard convened a council of war. The leaders of the army, the heads of the military orders, the French nobles, the local barons, all gave their opinion, and the consensus was grim. To advance now would be suicide. The weather was impossible, their supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and Saladin's army was waiting for them in the hills. Even if they took the city, they could never hold it once the main army returned to the coast. With a heavy heart, Richard gave the order that no one wanted to hear. They were to retreat. For the rank-and-file soldiers, this was the ultimate betrayal. They had come so far, endured so much. They were within sight of the holy city, the golden dome glinting in the distance. One chronicler tells a poignant story of a knight who, looking towards the holy city, covered his face with his shield, weeping that he was not worthy to look upon the city that he had failed to save. Richard's popularity, once sky-high, plummeted. He was accused of cowardice, of lacking faith, of putting political calculation before the will of God. The French contingent was particularly vicious, composing satirical songs mocking King Richard with the heart of a timid hare. The army limped back to the coast, their spirits as sodden as their clothes. To keep his men occupied and restore some semblance of purpose, Richard marched them south to refortify the city of Ascalon. It was strategic work, aimed at cutting Saladin's supply lines from Egypt, but it felt like a pointless diversion to an army that had dreamed of praying at the Holy Sepulchre. The divisions only deepened. The French contingent eventually refused to cooperate at all and marched north to Acre and Tyre, effectively splitting the crusade in two. The Lionheart's great enterprise was on the verge of complete collapse. And then, as if his problems in the Holy Land weren't enough, devastating news began to arrive from home. A succession of messengers brought letters from his mother Eleanor and his chancellor in England. The news was alarming. His brother, his youngest brother John, the one they called Lachlan, was making his move. John, whom Richard had foolishly showered with lands and titles before he left, was now showing his true colors. He was spreading rumors that Richard was dead. He was trying to seize control of the royal administration and was making open overtures to Richard's greatest enemy. King Philip of France, free from his crusading vow, had wasted no time. He had returned to Europe and was now actively plotting with John, promising to help him seize the English throne in exchange for the surrender of Richard's valuable lands in France, including the strategic territory of Normandy. The trap was closing. Richard was thousands of miles from home. His army in the Holy Land was fractured and demoralized. And back in Europe, a jackal and a spider were scheming to steal his crown and dismember his empire. He was caught in an impossible dilemma. Every day he stayed in Palestine brought his kingdom closer to ruin. But to leave now would mean abandoning his sacred vow, admitting defeat, and leaving Jerusalem in the hands of the Saracens. It was a choice between his earthly kingdom and his heavenly salvation. In April 1192, the situation came to a head. The nobles of the army came to Richard and gave him an ultimatum. They would not follow him any longer unless he resolved the leadership crisis. They forced him to agree to an election to finally decide who would be king of Jerusalem, his candidate Guy or their candidate Conrad. Richard, seeing he had no choice, agreed. The result was a foregone conclusion. The barons overwhelmingly elected the formidable Conrad of Montferrat. Richard, ever the pragmatist, accepted the verdict with surprising grace. In a stroke of genius, he compensated his loyal but useless vassal Guy by selling him the island of Cyprus, which Guy and his descendants would rule as a kingdom for the next 300 years. It seemed for a moment that the crisis was averted. The army was united behind a new leader. Conrad was now the king-elect, and plans could be made for a renewed assault on Jerusalem. But history had one more cruel twist in store. Just days after his election, as he was walking back from a dinner in the city of Tyre, Conrad of Montferrat was ambushed in a narrow street. Two men, disguised as monks, fell upon him and stabbed him to death. The king of Jerusalem was assassinated before he could even be crowned. The assassins were quickly captured and, under torture, confessed. They were members of the notorious Order of Assassins, the secretive Ismaili sect led by the mysterious figure known as the Old Man of the Mountain. But who had hired them? Suspicion immediately fell on Richard. Conrad had been his bitter rival. His death was incredibly convenient for the English king. Richard's enemies, particularly the French, had no doubt. They openly accused him of arranging the murder. Though there was no concrete proof, and some historians suggest Saladin or even Conrad's own rivals in Tyre were more likely culprits, the mud stuck. Richard's reputation was further blackened. The chivalrous hero was now seen by many as a ruthless murderer. The crisis of leadership was solved in a grimly efficient manner. Just a week after Conrad's death, his widow was married off to Richard's own nephew, Henry of Champagne, who was immediately acclaimed as the new king of Jerusalem. The army was finally united. The road to Jerusalem was open once more, and Richard, knowing that his time was running out, that the wolves were circling his throne back home, decided to stake everything on one last desperate gamble. He would march on Jerusalem again. This time, there would be no turning back. With the leadership crisis grimly resolved and his nephew installed as the new pliable king of Jerusalem, Richard the Lionheart knew the clock was ticking. The specters of his brother John and King Philip of France haunted his every waking moment, their treachery unfolding thousands of miles away. If he was to salvage his English crown and his French domains, he had to act now. He gathered the newly unified Crusader army, and in the blistering heat of early summer 1192, began the second march on Jerusalem. This time the mood was different. It was not the naive optimism of the previous autumn. It was a harder, more desperate resolve. This was their last chance. Richard pushed the army forward with relentless energy. He had learned from the mistakes of the winter campaign. He secured his supply lines, established fortified depots along the route, and used his tactical genius to fend off Saladin's ever-present skirmishers. Saladin, for his part, adopted a scorched earth policy. His forces poisoned wells, destroyed crops, and stripped the land of anything that could sustain the advancing Christian army. It was a race against time, a brutal contest of wills under a merciless sun. By June, they had done it. They had reached the same point where they had been forced to turn back in the winter, the small town of Beit Nuba, just a day's march from Jerusalem. This time, there was no rain, no mud. The sky was a brilliant, unforgiving blue. From the nearby hills they could see it, the prize, the goal of 2 years of bloodshed, toil, and prayer, the sun glinting off the golden dome of the rock, the imposing walls of the holy city. It was so close, so real. A wave of religious fervor swept through the camp. Knights wept and common soldiers fell to their knees in prayer. They were certain that this time victory was God's will. But Richard the Lionheart, standing at the threshold of immortal glory, was paralyzed by doubt. The warrior in him, the part that had earned him the name Lionheart, screamed for an assault, to lead the charge, to plant his banner on the Tower of David, to fulfill his sacred vow. It was the dream that had driven him across the world. But the king in him, the shrewd, pragmatic strategist, saw the cold, hard reality of their situation. He convened another council of war, but this time he structured it differently. He created a committee of 20 men, 5 Knights Templar, 5 Knights Hospitaller, 5 French nobles, and 5 local barons from the Holy Land. He tasked them with providing a final binding recommendation. Should they besiege Jerusalem, or should they turn their attention elsewhere, perhaps to Saladin's power base in Egypt? He was outsourcing the most important decision of his life, a sign of his profound inner turmoil. He knew the answer they would give, but he needed to hear it from them. He needed the political cover for the heartbreaking choice he knew he had to make. The committee's verdict was unanimous and devastating. A siege of Jerusalem was military folly. Saladin's army was still intact and controlled the surrounding countryside. He would sever their supply lines from the coast within weeks. The city itself was heavily fortified, and its water sources had been poisoned. Even if they performed a miracle and took the city, the moment the main crusading army left for home, which most of the French and English knights were now desperate to do, a skeleton garrison would be left to face the full vengeful might of Saladin's empire. They would be condemning the holy city to be reconquered and its defenders to be slaughtered. To take Jerusalem now, they argued, was to lose it forever. The dream was dead. The crusade and its ultimate objective had failed. Richard had to give the order to retreat again. The news ripped through the army like a plague, shattering their morale and turning their fervent hope into bitter resentment. The French contingent, always his harshest critics, openly jeered him. The common soldiers felt utterly betrayed. It is here that we get one of the most human and poignant stories of Richard's entire life. A chronicler records that one day, as the army was preparing to withdraw, a knight called out to the king, "My lord, come here, and I will show you Jerusalem." Richard was nearby, but he refused to look. He raised his shield to cover his eyes and cried out that he was not worthy to look upon the holy city, since he could not deliver it from the hands of its enemies. Think of it. Richard the Lionheart, the arrogant, proud, seemingly invincible warrior king, publicly admitting his failure, his unworthiness. In that single, heartbreaking gesture, the legend becomes a man who had gambled everything and lost, a man whose personal pride was shattered by the immense weight of his responsibility. The conqueror of Cyprus, the victor of Arsuf, was ultimately defeated not by Saladin's sword, but by the cold, unforgiving logic of logistics and strategy. The retreat from Beit Nuba was a miserable affair. The army, now thoroughly demoralized and disunited, trudged back to the coast. Saladin's forces, sensing weakness, harassed them every step of the way. Richard, his own spirit seemingly broken, fell into a deep depression. He began to make serious preparations for his departure. He had failed in his holy quest. Now he had to go home and save his earthly one. He sent envoys to Saladin to negotiate a truce, packed his ships, and moved his small personal contingent of troops to Acre, preparing to set sail for England. The Third Crusade was fizzling out in an atmosphere of failure and recrimination, but Saladin was not a man to let a wounded lion escape without one last fight. Seeing the Crusader army in disarray and Richard preparing to leave, he saw his chance for a stunning counterstroke. He gathered his elite forces and, in a lightning march, descended upon the city of Jaffa, the strategic port Richard's army had so laboriously refortified. Saladin's attack was overwhelming. His sappers mined the walls, and his soldiers poured through the breaches. The small Christian garrison was slaughtered in the streets. A tiny remnant, led by the city's commander, managed to retreat into the central citadel, where they prepared for a final, hopeless last stand. They sent a desperate message to the Crusader army. Surrender was imminent. The news reached Richard as he was in his camp at Acre. A breathless messenger, a Genoese sailor, burst into his tent. Jaffa had fallen. The citadel was about to surrender. For any other leader, this would have been the final nail in the coffin. The sensible thing to do would be to hasten his departure, to save himself. But this was not just any leader. This was Richard the Lionheart. And this was not a strategic problem to be debated by a committee. This was a direct personal challenge. It was a fight. And that was a language Richard understood better than anyone. In an instant, the brooding, defeated king was gone, replaced by the berserker warrior. He did not hesitate. "As God lives," he is said to have roared, "I will be with them and give what help I can." He abandoned his plans to sail for home. He gathered a tiny force, a few dozen knights and several hundred crossbowmen, and crammed them onto a handful of Genoese galleys. The main army would have to follow by land, but that was too slow. Richard was going himself. Now. They sailed south with all speed. As they approached Jaffa, the scene was one of utter despair. Saladin's yellow banners were flying over the city walls. His army, tens of thousands strong, crowded the beaches and the town. The citadel was on the verge of surrender. Richard's own captains advised him to turn back. The situation was hopeless. They were a few hundred men against an entire army. Richard surveyed the scene from the deck of his galley, his red and gold ship leading the way. He saw a figure on the citadel walls who had seen his fleet approaching and had dropped a signal indicating they had not yet surrendered. That was all he needed. What happened next is the stuff of pure legend, the moment that, more than any other, cemented his immortal fame. He ordered his galleys to run straight onto the beach. The king's own ship was the first to ground itself. Richard, his great Danish axe in hand, was the first man into the water. Roaring in defiance, he waded ashore, waist deep in the surf, and charged directly into the Saracen army. The shock of his arrival was total. Saladin's men, who thought Richard was miles away in Acre, were stunned into disbelief. Was this really him, the King of England in person, leading a suicidal charge up the beach? His handful of knights and crossbowmen followed him, forming a tight semicircle of steel around him. The crossbowmen laid down a devastating covering fire, while Richard and his knights crashed into the enemy, hacking and slashing with a fury that seemed superhuman. The Saracens, caught completely by surprise, broke and fled from the beach, seeking the relative safety of the narrow city streets. Richard and his tiny force stormed into Jaffa, cleared the town, and triumphantly relieved the beleaguered garrison in the citadel. It was an act of such breathtaking, almost insane courage that it seemed to defy all military logic. He had retaken an entire city with a force that was barely large enough to be called a bodyguard. Saladin, who was in his tent a few miles away, was astonished when he heard the news. He could not believe that Richard had retaken Jaffa with so few men. He regrouped and a few days later launched a massive dawn counterattack, hoping to crush Richard's small force before the main Christian army could arrive. He found Richard's men camped outside the city walls, a tiny island of resistance in a sea of enemies. Richard had perhaps 55 knights with him, only 15 of whom had horses, and about 2,000 infantry. They were facing at least 7,000 of Saladin's elite cavalry. The odds were impossible, but Richard's tactical genius in a defensive battle was unparalleled. He arranged his infantry into a shield wall, with spearmen kneeling in the front rank, their spear butts dug into the sand, creating a deadly hedge of steel points. In the gaps, he placed his crossbowmen. Behind this wall were his few precious knights. Saladin's cavalry charged again and again, but they could not break that disciplined, desperate line. And at the heart of it all was Richard. Whenever the line seemed about to buckle, he would lead a countercharge himself, a terrifying figure who seemed to be everywhere at once. The Arab chronicler Baha al-Din, an eyewitness, wrote of the battle with a sense of awe. I saw the King of England in person, galloping along the length of his line, shouting to his men to stand firm. His onslaughts were terrible. Never have we seen a more spirited or determined combatant. The Battle of Jaffa was Richard the Lionheart's masterpiece. It was a triumph not of strategy, but of sheer, indomitable will and personal courage. He had single-handedly saved the crusade from total humiliation and had inflicted another galling defeat on Saladin. But the victory came at a terrible cost. After the battle, Richard, exhausted by his superhuman efforts and having drunk contaminated water, fell gravely ill with a fever, the same sickness that had struck him down at Acre. Saladin, in a now famous gesture of chivalric respect for his great adversary, sent his own personal physicians to Richard's camp, along with fresh fruit and snow from the mountains, to cool his fever. The war had reached its end. Both sides were utterly exhausted. The two greatest warriors of their age had fought each other to a bloody, honorable standstill. It was time to make peace. Lying in his sickbed at Jaffa, the Lionheart was at his most vulnerable. The fever that raged within him was more deadly than any Saracen sword. He had pushed his body and his will to their absolute limits, and now, in the quiet aftermath of his most legendary victory, his mortality had caught up with him. Saladin's gesture of sending fruit and his own doctors was more than just chivalry. It was an acknowledgement that the great game was over. Both kings, titans of their age, were exhausted. Their armies were depleted, their treasuries empty, and their people weary of a war that had no clear end. From their respective sickbeds, for Saladin too was now suffering from illness, the two leaders conducted their final negotiations. There would be no grand conquest of Jerusalem. The dream was laid to rest, replaced by the grim necessity of peace. After weeks of back-and-forth diplomacy, they finally reached an agreement. On the 2nd of September 1192, the Treaty of Jaffa was signed. It was a 3-year truce. The coastal cities that the Crusaders had conquered, from Tyre down to Jaffa, would remain in Christian hands, forming a revived, if truncated, kingdom of Jerusalem. The fortress of Ascalon, which had cost so much blood and treasure to rebuild, was to be demolished, creating a neutral buffer zone. And most importantly for the common soldiers and pilgrims, the treaty guaranteed that unarmed Christian pilgrims would have free and safe access to visit the holy sites in Jerusalem. They had not conquered the holy city, but they could now pray within its walls. It was a pragmatic peace, a compromise that left neither side fully satisfied, but allowed both to claim a measure of success. Richard had not fulfilled his vow to liberate the Holy Sepulchre, but he had saved the Christian presence in the Holy Land from utter annihilation and had carved out a viable kingdom that would endure for another century. It was the best deal he could get, and he knew it. His work was done. It was time to go home. Richard himself never went to Jerusalem. When offered a safe conduct to visit the city as a pilgrim, he refused. He had sworn to enter it only as a conqueror, and he would not go as a tourist to the city he had failed to win. It was a final, proud, and perhaps bitter gesture from a king whose personal honor was everything. He stood on the coast and watched as the men he had led, the survivors of Acre and Arsuf, made their own personal pilgrimages. His crusade was over. On the 9th of October, 1192, Richard the Lionheart boarded a ship at Acre and set sail for home. He left behind a legend that would echo through the ages in both the Christian and Muslim worlds. The Arab chroniclers would write of him with a mixture of fear and awe, remembering Melik Rik, the terrifying but honorable warrior king. A few months after Richard's departure, his great rival Saladin, worn out by decades of warfare, would also die peacefully in his bed in Damascus. An era of giants had come to an end. Richard knew the journey home was fraught with peril. The seas were treacherous in late autumn, but the greater danger lay in the courts of Europe. His enemies were everywhere. King Philip of France was actively plotting against him. The supporters of Conrad of Montferrat still believed he was an assassin. And in Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI held a grudge against him for his alliance with Sicilian rivals. But Richard could never have anticipated the enemy who would prove to be his undoing, the man whose banner he had so arrogantly thrown into a moat. A terrible storm in the Mediterranean shattered Richard's small fleet. His ship was wrecked near the top of the Adriatic Sea, forcing him ashore in hostile territory. His only route back to his own lands was overland through the domains of his sworn enemy, Duke Leopold V of Austria. Disguising himself and his small party of attendants as humble pilgrims, Richard began a desperate, secret journey across the heart of Europe. It was an impossible charade. How could a man like Richard, 6'5", regal in his bearing, and accustomed to giving orders, ever pass for a humble pilgrim? The ruse was bound to fail. In a tavern just outside Vienna, his party was recognized. According to one popular story, the giveaway was a magnificent jeweled ring on the finger of the pilgrim king. Duke Leopold's men surrounded the tavern, and Richard, seeing no escape, surrendered. The Lionheart was a captive. Duke Leopold, savoring his long-awaited revenge for the humiliation at Acre, had captured the most famous man in Christendom. It was the political kidnapping of the millennium. The Duke soon handed his prize captive over to his overlord, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who was delighted to have such a valuable pawn in his power games. The emperor imprisoned Richard in a series of German castles, including the infamous fortress of Trifles, holding him for a king's ransom, a truly astronomical one. Back in England, the news was met with disbelief and horror, but for two men, It was the best news they could have possibly received. Prince John and King Philip of France were jubilant. They redoubled their efforts, with Philip reportedly sending a message to John that read, "Look to yourself, the devil is loosed." They offered the emperor a huge sum of money to either keep Richard imprisoned indefinitely, or better yet, hand him over to them. But they had not reckoned with one person, Richard's mother, the indefatigable Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now in her 70s, the old queen emerged from her semi-retirement and threw herself into the fight for her favorite son's freedom. She became the heart and soul of the resistance against John and Philip. She rallied the loyal barons, secured the kingdom, and began the gargantuan task of raising the ransom demanded by the emperor, 150,000 marks of silver. It was a sum equivalent to 2 or 3 times the entire annual income of the English crown, a crippling burden on the kingdom. For over a year, Eleanor orchestrated a massive fundraising campaign. A special scutage tax was levied on every landowner in England. Churches were forced to give up their precious gold and silver chalices. Monasteries were stripped of their wealth. The entire country was bled dry to pay for the freedom of a king most of them had never even seen. Finally, the ransom was paid. In February 1194, after 15 months in captivity, Richard the Lionheart was finally set free. The devil was loosed indeed. Richard landed in England in March 1194. He was a king returning from the dead. His presence was enough to make his brother John's rebellion collapse. John's castles quickly surrendered, and the traitorous prince himself fled to France to seek the protection of his puppet master, Philip. Richard, in a surprising act of clemency brokered by their mother, eventually forgave his younger brother, supposedly remarking, "He is only a child who has had evil counselors." Richard stayed in England for only a few weeks, long enough to have himself ceremonially recrowned to wash away the shame of his imprisonment and to raise yet more money for the real war that lay ahead. Then, in May 1194, he crossed the English Channel to France. He would never set foot in England again. The last 5 years of his life were consumed by a single-minded obsession, taking back every castle, every town, and every acre of land that Philip of France had stolen from him. It was a grueling, relentless war of sieges and skirmishes, a war Richard fought with all his old brilliance and energy. He was back in his element, the master tactician, the frontline commander. He pushed Philip's forces back, reclaimed his territory, and to defend his beloved Normandy, he built one of the most advanced and formidable castles of the age, the magnificent Chateau Gaillard, or Saucy Castle. He built it in just over a year, a testament to his engineering genius and his utter determination. He called it his fair daughter. By the spring of 1199, Richard was at the height of his success. He had all but driven Philip out of his lands. The war was nearly won. He was besieging the minor, insignificant castle of Châlus-Chabrol in the Limousin, mopping up the resistance of a rebellious vassal who was rumored to have unearthed a hoard of Roman gold. One evening, on the 25th of March, Richard was walking the siege lines without his full armor on, inspecting his troops. He was confident, almost casual. From the battlements of the castle, a lone crossbowman saw the towering figure of the king and took a pot shot. The bolt struck Richard in the left shoulder, near his neck. It was not at first a mortal wound, but the surgery to remove the bolt was botched. The wound turned gangrenous. The Lionheart, the warrior who had survived the bloody melee at Arsuf and the suicidal charge at Jaffa, was laid low by a random shot from an obscure castle wall. As he lay dying, Richard did 2 remarkable things. He bequeathed his kingdom and all his lands to his brother John, securing the succession. And then he asked that the crossbowman who had shot him, a young man named Peter Basil, be brought before him. Richard, in a final act of kingly magnanimity, forgave the boy. He ordered him to be set free and given a sum of money. "Live on," he is said to have told him, "and by my bounty behold the light of day." It was a gesture of chivalry worthy of the legend. After his death, however, one of Richard's mercenary captains flouted the king's final wish, had the boy flayed alive, and then hanged him. On the 6th of April, 1199, with his beloved mother Eleanor by his side, Richard the Lionheart died. He was 41 years old. The greatest warrior in Christendom was gone, and so the legend was sealed. But as the centuries passed and historians began to look beyond the heroic ballads, a more complex, more intriguing, and more human picture of Richard began to emerge. And at the heart of that picture is the great unanswered question of his life, the nature of his heart. History glorifies Richard as the ultimate icon of medieval masculinity. But his private life was a series of profound contradictions. Here was a king who spent a mere 6 months of his 10-year reign in England, a king who failed to produce a single legitimate heir, a catastrophic failure for a medieval monarch, a king whose marriage to Berengaria of Navarre was a cold, distant political necessity. They spent almost their entire married life apart, a union more of name than of fact. Richard's relationship with Philip of France defies easy explanation. The contemporary chronicler Roger of Howden wrote that they ate every day at the same table and from the same dish, and at night their beds did not separate them. This passionate love, as Howden called it, astonished even Richard's father, who wondered what it could mean. Modern historians like John Gillingham argue this intense intimacy, combined with Richard's disinterest in his wife and lack of children, suggests he was likely homosexual. In this view, his entire life of crusading and warfare was a performance, an effort to sublimate a truth that could not be spoken and prove his masculinity in a fiercely homophobic era. Conversely, other historians caution against applying modern labels of sexuality to a 12th century figure. They argue that the chronicler's language was simply more effusive, and bed sharing was a common political tool to symbolize an unbreakable alliance. They explain his lack of an heir by his long absences at war, concluding he was simply a man consumed by politics with little interest in domestic life. We will never know for certain. The evidence is tantalizing, but inconclusive. Richard took that secret, if there was one, to his grave. But the debate itself is profoundly important. It forces us to see beyond the one-dimensional caricature of the Lionheart to a man trapped between public duty and his private heart. Whether his great love was for Philip or for the battlefield, it is clear that the conventional life of a king held no appeal for him. In the end, Richard's story is a towering monument to the contradictions of the human experience. He was a hero and a butcher, a devoted son and a rebellious traitor, a chivalrous knight and a ruthless politician. He was a king of England who barely spoke English and a French duke who became an English legend. His legacy is not just one of castles and crusades. It is a powerful reminder that our heroes are never as simple as the stories we tell about them. Behind every Lionheart, there is a human heart, with its own hidden vulnerabilities, its own secret sorrows, and its own untold loves. In a world that demanded he be a lion, perhaps his greatest and most private battle was the struggle, simply, to be Richard.